What a wonderful chance today to share Dayton's links to Lincoln. And amazingly enough, there's another one that I just found out today I want to share with you, and then we'll get started with the different people who have come to either bring something that was used by Lincoln or they have a family story that's connected to Lincoln. So we don't want to spend any more time on that. But with us today is a woman by the name of Winifred Dines. Would you stand up, please, for us? She's 101 years old, which is wonderful. But what is even more special is I'm going to read this little bit from a letter that she wrote to Sam Black, who's the young student sitting next to her. She said, "My grandfather was in the theater the night Lincoln was shot. He was a soldier stationed in the area, and that night attended Ford's Theater. As Booth jumped over the balcony, draped in bunting, he lost the spur from his boot, which fell at my grandfather's feet. He picked it up and briefly held it in his hand and then gave it to an usher, feeling it had value as help in identifying the assailant." What a wonderful connection and link we have right here in Dayton. Thank you so much for coming today. That's a marvelous story. And as far as she did meet Lloyd Ostendorf, and his comment was that the original spur was never found, so we don't know what that usher did with it. And the one that's on the boot at the museum is not the original. So we know who had it temporarily, at least. We're going to sort of start at the beginning of Lincoln's life because that seems like a logical place to begin. And about a year ago, I was standing in line near Dan Foley, waiting to go in to see The Last Truck premiere. And Lincoln came up. It always does, I guess, in my conversations with people. But he started telling me a marvelous story, and he's here today to share his family's connection to Lincoln. And I know that Dan needs no introduction because he's our county commissioner of great merit. He's running, I'll put that plug in. He's running this year. He doesn't have to campaign in this group, but he does have to leave before the afternoon is over. So we want him to begin with his story. So Dan?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for letting me be here today, and Mary Beth, thank you for what you've done. You know, a year ago, the Lincoln Society really did a wonderful thing at the old courthouse. I had the privilege of bestowing some awards to young people who wrote some of the essays, and thank you for that, because it was really a great tribute to Lincoln, but it was also an opportunity for young folks to really to kind of latch on to that. So I appreciate it. So in my family, I mentioned this to Mary Beth last year. I feel a little bit like the person who didn't quite finish their homework assignment today. I just want to tell you that. But I'm also here to ask for a little help on this, possibly too. In my family, my father's side is Irish, my mother's side is Scottish, and we have a connection to the Lincoln family on my mother's side. On my father's side, we've done a lot of work. We've kind of been back to the ancestral home in Ireland. It's Wexford County, Ireland, a very small little community. There's a church, there's a pub. You know, of course, that's probably any town in Ireland, right? But on my mother's side, I can't say that I've actually kind of seen the physical connection to her family. So much the quick vignette I'm going to give you about our connection to Lincoln is really passed on through discussions. But this week, so I'll tell you what this is, what this connection is, and then maybe I will, when I finish the assignment, maybe I'll try to come back. And I noticed that in March, I noticed you're going to be doing some campaigning 1860 style, and unfortunately, the reason I have to leave early is because I have to do some campaigning 2010 style today. So, but My mother's name is, her maiden name is Wallace, and she's Scottish. It's Scottish roots, with some Russian influence as well. My mother grew up in Detroit. She moved to Dayton when she married my father, and she worked for the University of Dayton. They still live here. My mother's father was named Arthur Irving Wallace. He was born in Chicago. His mother was a woman named Molly Froke Wallace. Molly's sister, which would have been my mother's, that would have been my mother's grandmother's sister, was a woman named Augusta Hanks. Augusta was married to Hieronymus Hanks, and they lived in Decatur, Illinois. And Hieronymus, as it is told through the family discussions, was the third cousin of Nancy Hanks, who would have been Abraham Lincoln's mother. Now, you now know the sum total of my knowledge about our connection to the Lincoln family. I will tell you that furious emails were going back and forth on the Wallace side of the family this week, so that, and thankfully my aunt, who lives in Annapolis, Maryland, has some fairly complete documentation of our connection. And she's going to be coming to Dayton as it happens next week, and so I'm going to ask her, she's coming to Cincinnati, so I'm going to ask her to try to bring that, and I would love to copy that and share it with the society. I wear it as a badge of honor, and I've tried my best to also pass it on to my kids, that we have some connection. And I think probably my job would be to understand that a little better, and maybe if I could share this written information with the society, maybe you could help me understand it too, because it would be an honor and it would be a very nice thing.
But now the second person I'd like to introduce is Nancy Diggs. So Nancy, if you would come up and share your family story. It sort of is on the early side of Lincoln's life again.
But it does begin at the beginning, because I am related to the midwife who delivered Abraham Lincoln, the granny woman. And my family was from LaRue County, Kentucky. So, you always wish you'd asked your grandparents more when they were alive. And remember that, young man. And I wonder sometimes, my grandmother on my mother's side was born about 10 years after the Civil War, and she could remember that there was a very old former slave living on the property, and although he'd been freed, he had no place to go. But I don't know whether they were on the southern side or not, but on the Brown side, my father's side, I know that a couple of people fought for the Union, and it is on the Brown side that I know about a couple of connections to Peggy Walters. My grandfather's mother's maiden name was Walters, and I had heard that his great aunt was a connection to his grandfather's mother's maiden name was Walters. So you see, it is sort of distant, but I'm sure in a small community like that, everybody was pretty well related anyway. Peggy Walters was very young when she was called to attend the birth of Abraham Lincoln, and years later, in 1864, she was attending a picnic on the grounds where Lincoln had been born, and so people began to talk about the event, and Peggy Walters mentioned that she was present when Abraham Lincoln was born, and she told the following story of the birth. Oh, by the way, she had 13 children, so I'm sure that there are lots of people related to her. I was 20 years old then, and helping to bring a baby into the world was more an event to me than it became afterward. But I was married young and had a baby of my own, and I had helped Mother, who, as you know, was quite famous as a granny woman. And I had gone several times to help when I was sent for. It was Saturday afternoon, I remember, when Tom Lincoln sent over and asked me to come. And I got up behind the boy that rode across to fetch me, and I rode across to the cabin that then stood here. It was a short ride, less than a mile. It was winter, but it was mild winter, and I don't think there was any snow. If there was any then, it wasn't much, and no snow fell that night. They sent for me quite as soon as there was any need, for when I got there, nothing much was happening. They sent for her two aunts, Miss Betsy Sparrow and Miss Polly Friend, and these both came. But they lived about 2 miles away, so I was there before them, and we all had quite a spell to wait, and we got everything ready that we could. They were poor folks, but so were most of the neighbors, and they didn't lack anything they needed. Nancy had a good feather bed under her. It wasn't a goose feather bed, hardly anyone had that kind then, but good hen feathers, and she had blankets enough. There was a little girl there, 2 years old. Her name was Sarah. She went to sleep before much of anything happened. Well, there isn't much that a body can tell about things of that kind. Nancy had about as hard a time as most women, I reckon. Easier than some, and maybe harder than a few. It all came along kind of slow, but everything was regular and all right. The baby was born just about sunup on Sunday morning. Nancy's 2 aunts took the baby and washed him and dressed him, and I looked after Nancy. That's about all there is to tell. I remember it better than I do some cases that came later, because I was young and hadn't had so much experience as I had afterward. But I remember it all right well. Oh yes, and I remember one other thing. After the baby was born, Tom came and stood there beside the bed and looked down at Nancy lying there, so pale and so tired. And he stood there with that sort of a hangdog look that a man has, sort of guilty-like, but mighty proud. And he says to me, "Are you sure she's all right, Ms. Walters?" And Nancy kind of stuck out her hand and reached for his and said, "Yes, Tom, I am all right." And then she said, "You're glad it's a boy, Tom, aren't you?" "So am I." No, there isn't much you can tell anybody about things of that sort, but Tom Lincoln was mighty anxious about his wife while she was suffering, and mighty good to her, too. And they were both proud and happy that it was a boy. You can't tell much about the birth of a baby except that you were there and that the baby was born, but you can tell whether folks wants the baby or not, and whether they love or hate each other on account of it. I was young then, and I noticed and remembered everything. I remember it a heap better than I remember much that happened afterward. I tell you, I never saw a prouder father than Tom Lincoln, and I never saw a mother more glad than Nancy was to know that her baby was a boy. And they sort of explained to me how they named the little girl Sarah because the name Abraham didn't fit, and Sarah was the next best. For Tom's father that was killed by Indians when Tom was a little boy, his name was the one they wanted the first baby to have. And so Nancy says to Tom, "Now we can use a name we couldn't use before." And Tom says he, "Yes, Nancy, and it's a right good name. This here baby boy," says he, "is named Abraham Lincoln."
So it wasn't an email today. I got a T-mail that Mr. Lincoln was going to be with us. And he is, and I'm going to ask him to please come up in front now. Come on, Abe. So pleased you're here today. Thank you so much for coming. That's wonderful. The next person I want to introduce is Bebe McCullum. So would you come up, Mrs. McCullum?
Well, I grew up in Illinois, so I am up to here in Abraham Lincoln and loved it all my life. Abraham and Mary Todd were married in my great-great-uncle's home. That was Ninian Edwards. Ninian was appointed to be the territorial governor of Illinois by President Andrew Jackson, and then he was the 3rd governor of Illinois. So Elizabeth Edwards, Mrs. Ninian, was the sister to Mary Todd, and so she brought her 3 younger sisters from Kentucky up to Springfield, and she found boyfriends and husbands for all 3 of them. But as the story goes, there's lots of family stories in this now. As the story goes, Abraham and Mary Todd decided very suddenly to be married because Mary Todd's father was very much against Mary marrying Abraham Lincoln. She thought he was cheap white trash. Sorry about that. So they hurried up and in less than one day planned the wedding, and Elizabeth was so upset with Mary Todd for doing that to her, and she said the cake was still warm when they served it at the reception. It was all done in such a hurry. Okay, Ninian Edwards' brother was Cyrus, my great-great-grandfather, and Cyrus had a son, Nelson Green Edwards, who was my great-grandfather, and both Cyrus and Nelson were in the Illinois State Legislature under their brother and uncle, which I thought was kind of interesting. We sort of packed the ballot box, I think. So anyway, Nelson, excuse this voice, Nelson and Abraham Lincoln were very good friends. They were young lawyers, and they were serving that Southern Circuit of Illinois. And they rode the circuit together, and grandfather said the only thing he didn't like about it was that he had to sleep with Abraham, and he always pulled all the covers over. And now that's family lore way down there. So unfortunately, my great-grandfather died at the age of 32, and in 1852, so he did not live to see his good friend make it to be President of the United States. I always thought that was a sad thing. Supposedly, great-grandfather caught a very bad cold when they were on a long, cold, rainy trip on the circuit, and he was never well after that. And I guess they called it consumption and all that. So when, however, they were such good friends, and when my grandfather was born, my great-grandfather Nelson said, "Oh, Harriet Josephine, I really want to name him Abraham." And Harriet Josephine pulled up to her full height and she said, "I love that Abe too, but there will be no Abrahams in this Edwards family." So now let's see. The word was in the family that at one time Abe was engaged to Matilda Edwards. That would have been Nelson's older sister. And they tell me there is a letter someplace in the family. I've never seen it. But there is a letter stating that she was engaged to Nelson. But I have seen a letter that said that Matilda wrote to her younger sister, and she said, "I'm so excited because Mr. Lincoln is going to call today." So you were very busy.
Now I haven't heard about this Matilda story. Do you want to bring that up, or you'd like to just let that alone?
Well, some people say I probably did have a liking for her. She was attractive, and so was Mary. You know, they were both very attractive ladies, and
There you
both
were.
of them came from a good family, and of course I came from a very poor, uneducated family, and but Matilda was a very nice lady, and I finally decided that Mary was the one, though. You know, that was maybe
good.
my first thought was Matilda, but Mary was my final one, and that's one that counts.
All right, absolutely. Back to our book with Lloyd Ostendorf, and he was such a recognized, world-renowned scholar of Lincoln. And we're very fortunate to have in Dayton his son Dan, who has some of Lloyd's objects. And I'm going to ask Dan if he'll come up now and share this, because it's connected to the 150th celebration we did a year ago at the courthouse. And I'll let you tell the story and show what you brought, if you'll come up to the podium.
One and only one visit to Dayton, Ohio, happened to be September 17th, Saturday, 1859. Mr. Lincoln was here primarily at the invitation of the local politicos who had, I don't know if you want to say suffered through or been aware of Stephen Douglas's visit earlier, about a week earlier. The visit was kind of an outgrowth of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They prevailed upon Mr. Lincoln to come to Dayton and give his side of the arguments, primarily about slavery, what should happen with the new territories. Lincoln arrived shortly before noon, and he was on his way from Columbus to Cincinnati. He was in Dayton for about 3 hours left on the 3 o'clock train to Cincinnati. If he did all the things that everyone here says he did, he was a very busy man. One thing that we do know that he did, he had a room at the Phillips House, which at that time was the best accommodations in Dayton. He did take lunch at the Phillips House before he gave a speech down at the courthouse steps at 3rd and Main. it just so happened that a number of people gathered to kind of have lunch with him, and there was an individual there by the name of John Williams Harries. Now, Mr. Harries was born in Wales, and I keep forgetting actually in 1783. At the time of Lincoln's visit, he was a state senator. He also owned a brewery here in town, which was on the west side of Jefferson Street, north of First Street. He and his daughter, who was age 39 at the time, by the name of Annie Harries, were having lunch, and she wanted to get Mr. Lincoln's autograph. Well, they went over to Lincoln's table, and as usual, Mr. Lincoln was holding forth with jokes, and he was well known for that. They interrupted their little gathering there, and Annie asked for Mr. Lincoln's autograph. Unfortunately, no one seemed to have any paper to write on, but she got the brilliant idea of reaching into her bag and pulling out her small Bible. So Mr. Lincoln inscribed a Bible to Annie Harries, and we believe it happened at the Phillips house during his visit. And that's what I have here today to show you. I know many of you have already seen it. I'll hold it up here, and then after the presentation, if you want, I'll be up here, and you can come up and take a closer look so we won't interrupt the presentations. But this is the Bible. You can see it's kind of covered in velvet, and Mr. Lincoln inscribed inside here. Let's see. It says Dayton, Ohio, September 17th, 1859. Miss Annie Harries. Live by the words within these covers, and you'll be forever happy. Yours truly, Abe Lincoln. Now it's inscribed in pencil. As you know, my father was a collector of Lincoln items. There are a number of people who don't believe that this is genuine. A number of people claim that Lincoln only signed things in pen. So that's depending upon which authority you talk to. This may or may not be genuine, but we believe it happens to be. So here it is, and I'll be glad to show it to you after the program.
Also with us this afternoon is a gentleman on whom we relied very heavily in the Lincoln Society, both for programs, for authentication, for just general knowledge of Lincoln, and he is outside of Montgomery County, but we decided we'd bend the rules a little bit and allow Gary Kersey to come in from Wilmington to share some of his collection and some of his Lincoln stories. So Gary, welcome back. It's your turn now at the podium.
Reproduction photograph of Lincoln taken in March 1864 by a photographer by the name of Berger. I think he was associated with Matthew Brady's studio. But it's a pretty good likeness of the president. You like this, don't you? Yeah, you like it. The watch chain is very obvious here. And things are looking a little better in 1864 for Lincoln. And so you will see variations of this, and people would take, particularly after the president was shot, after he was killed, and people had the ability back then to change something, to make it better. Make it better. So this is nothing new that we're able to do today. Here is a reconstructed issue, and it's basically the same, but it's been touched up. Now my heart leaped when the person that we had the sale for, she said, "Well, Gary, I want you to have this." And the reason why is the historical accuracy of what's around this. And the top left, Lincoln is standing on the back of the train. He's getting ready to leave Springfield. It's a light rain. It's early in the morning. He thanks his neighbors for coming. He tells them that he's not sure if he'll ever see them again. Well, guess what? He didn't see them again. He barely carried the city of Springfield in the election. He lost the county vote. He could have been bitter, but no. He thanked the neighbors for coming out. The bottom corner is the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a lot of people that said, you know, you're not going to get these boys to fight and continue to fight until you say that one of the reasons why we're fighting is because of slavery. And so finally in July, Lincoln of 1862, Lincoln hints that he may be considering emancipating slaves. And finally in September of 1862, at a cabinet meeting, he breaks the news. Now, I said to you, are you listening? I said to you that he breaks the news to his cabinet. He brought his cabinet in. He did not ask for their input. He made the decision. He made the decision to do this. The bottom, it says, lying in state in Washington. When Lincoln was killed, the body first lay in state at the White House. I believe that this artist did this scene, and I believe that this is the funeral in the White House. It was Tad's 10th birthday. And they left Washington, D.C. in a ferocious snowstorm. And they got on the Carrie Martin steamship, and down the Potomac River they go, and they land, and it's still snowing. And so the review of the troops had to be delayed. And so on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday, Lincoln basically reviews 70,000 troops. 70,000. The day he reviewed the cavalry, there were 300 officers. Now I'm going to tell you what else. When the officers went by, the president took his hand to his hat and saluted. When the soldiers went by, Lincoln took his hat off. Guess what he's doing in this picture? He has taken his hat off. The artist knew what he was doing. Isn't that a refreshing thing?
We have one more speaker, but before I ask him to come up, one of the ladies here said, oh, I have a little story I would like to tell. So I would like you to come up and identify yourself and share what you would like to share with us.
I'm Betty Martell, and I have told this to a few other people, I think maybe Mr. Kersey, to verify something. We in Xenia say that Lincoln stopped in Xenia, as opposed to this business of him being in Dayton. His being in Dayton, I think, was part of his campaign. But on the inauguration, when the inauguration was coming up, the train stopped in Xenia for maybe just a water stop or a very short time. And I believe Lincoln was on the back, wherever they are on the train usually. And he patted two little boys on the head. That was Sam and Will Kyle. They were twins. They were about 5 or 6 years of age. And my grandmother was a Kyle, related to these two twin boys. So that was our claim to fame with Lincoln. One other quickie thing, I was on a field trip to the Woodman Fen this last Friday, and we saw lots and lots of Eupatorium, which is the white snake root that killed Nancy Hanks Lincoln.
I'm Joan Perkins, and when we lived in Dayton during the 40s, Sam Hanks, the race driver, came to our house to visit, and he is related to my father's family in some way. I've never really, and I can remember as a child playing with, I think, some children outside of my grandmother's house, and I think Sam was one of those children at that time, but I've never researched it. That's all I have to say. The lore is that he was related to Nancy Hanks in some way.
This is Tom Cecil, who really needs no introduction to most of you. He's the one that got the idea that we should have a Lincoln group in town, and so he is our president of the Lincoln Society.
Who knows the last words that Lincoln spoke at Ford Theater during the night of the assassination? Apparently, Lincoln turned to Mary Todd and said, "Do you think they will mind if we hold hands?" And he said, "I don't think they'll mind at all." And those were the last words.
My connection to Lincoln is through a very near and dear relative, a sixth cousin 4 generations removed. That means he was my great-grandfather's 6th cousin. But his name was Christopher Minor Spencer, and he was the inventor of Spencer repeating firearms, one of which, and most known, was the Spencer repeating rifle. Developed this just before the Civil War, got it well developed, and was selling it to various organizations in the Civil War. He was trying to get the Army to buy large numbers of them. And as part of that, the company arranged for him to demonstrate his rifle to President Lincoln. Beforehand, there had been some, I guess he sent one in and it didn't operate too well, and Lincoln said no thanks. So they made another one they made sure it was operating and asked for another round. And they sent Mr. Spencer, he was, I forget, his late 20s at the time, almost 30 years old, along as the best representative to show him how it operates. And I have here, happens to be a carbine. It's about 6 or 7 inches shorter than the rifle, but the operation is the same. And he developed this, and it was the first repeating metallic cartridge rifle that was really operative and saw a lot of action in the Civil War. On the 19th of August in '63, Lincoln and Christopher Spencer met at the White House, and they went out in the front yard toward what is now the Washington Monument. He loaded it up, gave it to Mr. Lincoln, and he shot the rifle 7 times and hit the board all 7 times. First one was pretty low, but the rest of them were right around the bullseye.